Hey guys, how's it going? Cymatics here. Welcome to part 4 of our Ableton beginner crash course. If you guys haven't already watched part 1, 2, or 3, I recommend you go back and do so because a lot of those things are going to be necessary to know to move on to this part. In this part, I'm going to be going into depth about Ableton's analog synthesizer. This is going to be teaching you guys about subtractive synthesis, which is one of the most basic forms of synthesis and really a fundamental one to know to move on to any of the other ones. I'm also going to be going into depth about the EQ8 and Ableton's compressor, which are two of their most useful tools. And I'm going to dive into some other effects in more detail so you can just understand how to use them, because in past tutorials I really just talked about bringing them in and kind of how they work, but we're going to go into a lot of detail about them now. If you guys already haven't grabbed our Ableton starter sample pack, I recommend you head to the description of this video and grab it. It's going to be all the professional sound examples you need to start writing great music. Now we've got a lot to cover in this video, so without further ado, let's get going. So we're going to start this video off by giving you guys a basic understanding of synthesis, and specifically with a type of synthesis known as subtractive synthesis, which is very basic. So first of all, synthesis is how you're actually going to make sounds in electronic music. It's how you're going to synthesize new sounds and create new sounds. Now there are a few types of synthesis, but the most popular probably is subtractive. And how subtractive synthesis works is it works by building up a big sound from the beginning, something very rich, stacking on a lot of ideas, and then subtracting with what are known as filters, taking away frequencies, scooping away at the end. So kind of building something up and taking away. It's quite basic. And that's it in its most basic form. Now, with a basic knowledge of subtractive synthesis and the common things you will see in subtractive synthesis, this is going to give you the foundation to go off on your own and learn different kinds of synthesis or expand your knowledge of synthesis. So the analog instrument here is Ableton's basic subtractive synth, and we're going to use this to give you the fundamentals. Now, a lot of these concepts are going to cross over to other synthesizers, and I'll explain them as we go. So the basic flow of sound represented here is first getting your source sound from an oscillator. An oscillator is what's going to oscillate your speakers. It's going to move the speakers forward and back at a certain rate. It's going to create the pitch. It's going to create the initial tone. Next, it goes into a filter here. This is where you're going to start to take away sounds. And lastly, the amp here, where you're going to set the volume for the individual oscillators. Now, these three things you're going to see in pretty much all subtractive synths. So try and wrap your head around this. Now, moving left to right, I'm going to give you a summary of each section. Now, everything I do above here is also mirrored below with oscillator 2, filter 2, and amp 2. So really just learning this top part will actually simplify things quite a bit. So first thing you have is your power button for the oscillator, turning on and off each oscillator here. And we're going to turn on oscillator 1. To the right of it, you have the initial volume, the output level of the first oscillator. And to the right here, you have the oscillator shape you're going to be picking. This is going to be what type of sound wave you're using. Depending on the subtractive synthesizer, you're going to have different options. But with analog here, I picked this one because you actually get very basic shapes. You get a sine wave. A sine wave is the purest sound you can get. It has no harmonics except for the original, and it sounds like this. The next type you have is a saw wave. A saw wave has a lot more harmonics. You can hear it's a lot more buzzy. And next you have the square, which has a different set of harmonics. Over time, you will begin to familiarize yourself with the sound of specific shapes, but don't worry about it too much. Just know you have those. And lastly, a noise one. And no matter how I play this across my keyboard, it's always going to be the same pitch. Or pitchless. To the right here, you have the octave. And most subtractive synthesizers are going to have this. You can select what octave this sound is playing. And for those that don't know what an octave is, it's 12 semitones. Next, you have semitones, so you can pitch this around. So it doesn't have to correlate to your keyboard. You can change that. And lastly, you have a detune in sense, which is quite a bit smaller. Once you have the sound the way you want it, then you can move on to the filter section. Filter section in synthesizers are how you're going to start to take away the sound. So first you're going to have to turn on the filter section here. And once on, you then select the filter type. Now filter types aren't something we've ever gone over before, so I'm going to show you right now with Ableton's filter beside it, so you can actually see a visual representation. So the first is a low pass 12 and a low pass 24. And what a low pass is it's a filter that will let the lows pass through and the highs get taken away as you pull the cutoff, and the cutoff is where the highs are getting cut off at. And you can see it represented by this orange line here, and listen to the high frequencies as I start to filter them away. Now the 12 versus 24 is the steepness of the cutoff, and that's something we'll actually be going over when we talk about the EQ section. So don't worry too much about that right now, but that's the low pass type. A band pass type is selecting just a specific frequency band like this and sweeping through that. So in those orange lines here, that's all we're hearing. Great. The next type is a notch, and this is actually doing the opposite. You're hearing everything except for a specific notch of frequencies that you're taking out. Next, you have a high pass, which is the opposite of a low pass. You're going to be taking out low frequencies and only letting the high frequencies remain. And lastly, you have a formant filter, which is actually specific to analog. You can't use that with the regular filter. And what it does is it represents the formant. And a formant is similar to a shape your mouth would make, like a vowel sound. I can actually pull up an EQ formant preset here just so you can hear it. This one's supposed to be an O, for example, and when a sound goes through it, you're filtering it out like your mouth would filter frequencies to create an O sound. And we can move that around. So it's a very vocal way of filtering things, and you're actually equipped with one here. So this is a great way to make a sound like it's talking. So now we've selected our sound, now we've filtered it, and now we can move on to the amp section. And the amp section here is not only where you're going to set the final output volume and the final panning, but it's where you're going to come across one of the most important things you're going to see in electronic music for synthesis that you need to know, and that is the ADSR, the attack, the decay, the sustain, and the release. That's represented here by this curve, and what this is how the sound acts over time. To really explain that, I could sing things that slowly come in and slowly release. Or I could do things that happen really suddenly and stop really suddenly. And that is the attack, decay, sustain, and release. The attack of a sound is how slow it takes for that sound to come in. So just focusing on the initial part of the sound here, I've got a really quick attack. So when I hit a note on my keyboard, it occurs immediately. However, if I slow down the attack to something a little slower, like to 4 seconds, now it's going to take 4 seconds for the sound to fully reach its maximum volume. You can hear it faded in, and you can make that a lot slower. So the attack of a sound is how long it takes to come in. The decay of a sound is how long it takes to reach the sustain volume. So when you hold out a note, you can actually have it play at a different volume than where it originally attacked. And you can see that represented here by this diagram. As I bring the sustain down, that sustain volume, what's going to happen when I hold the note on my keyboard, it's actually going to be a different volume than the initial attack. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring it down to 0 so you can really hear it, and I'm going to make a quick decay, 2 seconds. So after 2 seconds, the sound's going to attack at the attack time, which was 5 milliseconds. After that 5 milliseconds reaching its peak volume, it's going to take 1.5 seconds to sustain to a 0 amount, so you won't be able to hear it. You could hear it faded as I held that note. We can make this even quicker. So now all we're really hearing is the attack because it's a decayed to a low volume. Now you don't have to sustain it so little, you could just make the sustain less so the sound is a bit more of a click on the front and then it holds down a more lower and steady volume. So this just allows you to shape the volume and character of a sound, make things more real. For example, when you play a guitar, when you initially pluck it, it's going to have more volume in those first few milliseconds than after you release your finger. And lastly, that brings us with the release. And what this is how long the volume sustains after you let go of your keyboard. So for example, with a really long release here, 10 seconds, when I release my finger, the note's going to be held out. So I'm just going to press it for a really split second here, but it's going to hold out. And if I have a really tight release, when I press and release, it stops immediately. So with these settings here, and you can see by the diagram, it will react initially when I press my keyboard. Holding my keyboard, it will sustain that volume the entire time, and releasing my keyboard, it will immediately cut off. With these settings here, however, it's going to slowly come up, it's going to slowly reach a lower volume, and it's going to slowly release. Now these are the things that you're going to consider when designing sounds. What type of sound do you want? Do you want my sound to be hard and aggressive and react immediately? Or do I want it to be slow and soft and evolving? So the volume can actually really play a lot to the character of a sound as well, beyond just what source sound you're using and how you're filtering it. Now you're designing the volume character of the sound. Next, you have a master volume for the instrument here, and that master volume is going to be for both the top oscillator, filter, and amp section and the bottom oscillator, filter, and amp section. Now that you have a basic understanding of how the actual flow of the sound works, we can actually go into a bit more detail of some of the cool features you'll see in subtractive synthesizers. The next thing you'll see quite a bit of in synthesizers are modulators, and modulators are what are going to change these settings over time. This could be macros that you control yourself, or for example here, a very common one, LFOs. LFO stands for a low frequency oscillator. A low frequency oscillator is similar to the oscillator you would see that makes the frequencies in the beginning of a sound, except that oscillates so quickly that you can hear it. A low frequency oscillator oscillates so slowly you can't actually hear it. So instead you assign that slow movement to settings inside the synthesizer. Now the first thing you're going to see with a low frequency oscillator is selecting the rate at which it's going to move. So you can see here it reaches only 17 hertz. 17 hertz is very low. Nothing we can hear ourselves. And you can either select it to a loose rate like this where you're selecting a hertz value, or up here you can actually click this button here and you can synchronize it to your song by rhythmic value. Moving into the LFO section here, you can choose the shape, so you're not actually limited to a simple sine wave shape with a smooth oscillation. You can do chunkier ones like triangle or really chunky ones like rectangle, or you can even select a noise which is a little more random. Now with the rectangle section here, you'll notice the width section is no longer grayed out. And this lets you actually choose how that's going to oscillate. So you could have it reach its peak for a very short time and then sustain a low value for the longer set of time, or you can set the even or unevenness as you choose. There's a re-trigger button here, and when the re-trigger is enabled, the LFO will restart from the beginning every time you press a note. Otherwise, without it enabled, it's actually going to continue its cycle in time wherever it's supposed to be according to its musical value. You have an offset, so you don't have to start it exactly in the right part of its oscillation. So this being the peak value of its oscillation, this being its lowest value, you don't have to actually start it there. And then you have a delay and an attack. The delay will actually just delay how long it takes for the LFO to start working, and the attack will determine how long it takes to reach its peak value. So all of this is probably a little confusing right now, so let me apply the LFO to something inside of our synthesizer here. So when you click on the different windows inside of Analog here, you'll notice at the bottom it will say LFO1, 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 and these are all to different things. So for example, here you can see LFO1 to the level modulation, LFO1 to the panning modulation, here LFO1 to the pitch modulation. What this means is you can assign that slowly moving modulator to change the value over time. So in this instance, I'm going to have the 100% range of the LFO 100% affect the pitch of this sound. Now I'm going to pick something that is in a rectangle. I'll pick the sine wave, and you'll hear this is similar to a siren. I'll lessen how far it's going here, so maybe just half the value of the pitch range. And if I set this to a sine wave, you'll really hear it sounds like a siren here. The LFO can be mapped to a lot of other things as well. So moving over to the amp section, you can see it down here. I could map it to the panning, so it'll pan around our head. Or I can map this low frequency oscillator modulator to the volume. So our volume will go up and down at this rate here. So these LFOs let you add movement into the sound by mapping movement over time to different parameters. So that's as if this volume right now is doing this at this rate here. Now the top section has LFO1 and the bottom section has LFO2, so they each have their own respective LFO that can be mapped. I'm going to turn that off because we don't want the volume to change over time for this sound here. And now let's move back to the oscillator section here, where we can go over a few more important parameters. The first is a pitch envelope. So similar to the volume envelope that you found in here, this is how the pitch is going to change over time. You can hear that drop from a really high pitch to the bass note here. Or you can go the opposite way. So this can be used for cool risers and effects, or by making it really quick, can give just like a nice little intro and attack to the sound. So that is the built-in pitch envelope. Again, down here we saw that we have the LFO1 that can be assigned, the LFO1 that can be assigned to the pulse width of the square. So similar to how we saw here with the LFO and the rectangle, how you could change this width, you can actually do that with the oscillator that's generating sound here. So you can actually change the width of that square. And when that's being modulated over time, you hear it has this almost ripping phasing effect. That's a cool way to add movement into the sound. The sub oscillator here lets you include an oscillator of the same type at a lower octave, and you have simply a level percent here. And this just lets you stack more oscillators inside of this oscillator here. Now the last important feature is this F1 value here. And this is actually how much of this sound is going to this filter. So right now it's 100% going to filter 1. So the sound, the volume is going 100% through here and then through there and then out the main amp. But you can actually set a different value, and let's say 50-50. And when it's set to 50-50, 50% of the sound is going through this filter here, but then 50% of it is being diverted down and through this filter here. So now you can have different filter movements going on in parallel affecting one oscillator, and this can occur to both oscillators. You can send this oscillator to as much of each filter as you choose. Moving on to the filter section here, there are a couple more things you need to know. Here you have an ADSR, an attack, decay, sustain, release for the filter itself. So with it really quick here, we're actually going to filter down the frequencies really quickly in a low pass mode. If I make it really quick. You can hear it almost creates a pluck out of that sound by filtering down those frequencies. Not to overcomplicate things, we can move on from there. Now I just want to go over the last few settings here under the volume tab. And the first is the quick routing. So you can actually route how these oscillators are going, and you can see this diagram accurately represents what we were talking about before. So before, each respective oscillator was going to each respective filter, which was going to each of their own respective amps. But with different routing, you can have different results. So this one, oscillator 1 and 2 have to go to the first filter, have to go to the first amp. This one here, they both get it routed up to the first filter, down through another filter, and out through the amp. And another one here, oscillator 1 and 2, each going to both filters, each going to both amps. So just figure out what routing is right for you for the type of sound you're making. And the last few settings here, there is a vibrato amount. And a vibrato is essentially LFO to the pitch, making this thing vibrato, similar to a singer's vibrato in their voice. You have a unison and a detune, and when you turn this on, what it will do is it will actually duplicate the initial oscillators, and in this case duplicate. You can also quadruple. It will duplicate them and it will detune them, and this makes it sound more like a chorus, like multiple voices are singing, because when two voices sing, they're never the exact same pitch. There's a little detuning, and you can actually recreate that here. That'll beef up your sound. And lastly, you have a glide function, and what the glide does is when you play a different note on your keyboard, it will glide up to that other note if they cross over. So those are the absolute most basic and fundamental features of subtractive synthesis. I could go into a lot more depth in analog, but we've got a lot to cover in this video, so you guys have some homework to go read the manual and just learn a bit more of the features. But once you have a full and rich understanding of how this works, you can start to apply this to tons of other synthesizers out there. So now with your basic understanding of subtractive synthesis, let's move on to getting a deeper understanding of some of the effects inside of Ableton. So moving on to a deeper understanding of effects here, the first one I want to bring to your attention are two parameters that you're going to see on a large portion of the effects inside of Ableton, and just a large portion of the effects in general. And bringing in a random one here, let's go with the first one, amp. It is the power button here. The power button is going to be how you turn on and off devices. So you can have devices in your chain that aren't active, so you can maybe just test one out or leave it for later, and if you're unsure about it, so you can actually power on and off all of the devices with the power button here. Next, you have a hot swap button, so you can actually quickly switch out that effect for a different one at any time. To the right of that, you have a save button. What the save button does, and going back to something we talked about in a past video, it allows you to make your own presets. So if you change the settings of an effect and you like what you've designed, you can save that to your preset library under your user library. And at any time, you can drag that back in with the exact same settings. And lastly, one that you'll see on a lot of the effects, not all of them, but a lot of them, is this dry wet knob here. What dry wet means is the dry signal is the original signal without any effect on it. And a 100% wet signal is the sound 100% going through and being affected by this audio effect here. So you can actually find a balance by dialing back the dry wet. You're actually letting some of the pure unaffected signal that would have occurred before pass through unaffected and come out the other side. So I'm going to quickly put analog back here, and I'm just going to play a basic saw. And I'm going to throw the amp on again. And I'm going to make a really amped out, distorted version. Okay, so that's clearly a different sound. But now if I were to go completely to the dry signal, again, completely pure, unaffected analog coming through. And fully wet is pure analog going to the amp and coming out. And in the middle, we have a 50% blend of both. So this dry wet knob is how you'll actually blend effects and subtly use them because we don't always want to use a fully affected version of something. So those are some common things you'll see on a lot of the effects and even instruments inside of Ableton: the power, the hot swap, and the save. But now let's go into depth about some of the most important effects inside of Ableton. So the first one we briefly talked about is the auto filter, and just filters in general. Filters are going to be really important for shaping sounds. And filters again work like this. You have the full frequency spectrum from left to right in here, from the lowest frequency to the highest frequency. And what you can do is you can move this cutoff to select how you're removing this frequency. So in this case, I have a low pass filter, and the low pass filter is going to take out high frequencies as I sweep to the left. Something we already talked about. What we didn't talk about, however, is this Q. What this does is it changes the steepness of this cutoff, as well as adding bumps of volume to the cutoff so you can actually hear more of where you're sweeping. So if I make a really big cutoff, you'll really notice this sweeping sound. Because there's a bump of volume right before the edge where we start to remove frequencies. Without it, it's a lot more subtle. So it's up to you how you want to use that. Next, we have an LFO built into this thing that will automate the cutoff over time. So the first thing you want to do is select the amount, and the amount is it going the full distance, or is it going kind of just halfway from where the cutoff is and just moving slightly? We're going to do a full amount to make it very obvious. Next, picking a shape. This time you have a few more shape options, and you can see what they are here. I'm going to pick the sine wave. Next, you're selecting a rate, either freeform or synchronized to your music. And then after, you have a phase. Now the phase, how this works is if it's going to be different in each ear. So right now it's actually going to filter one ear differently than the other, giving this weird stereo effect. With a phase of 0 though, they're both going to be filtered in the same way. Slow down the rate so you can really hear what's going on. So right now, with a full amount value at 1/4 note, both ears are filtering the frequencies of this incoming signal from left to right. Perfect. So those are the common settings that you'll see in almost all filters. So that's a good summary of it there. Moving on, I'm going to give you guys a deeper understanding of the EQ, which is very similar to the filter in a lot of ways, where you're going to be filtering and shaping the sound, except with this, you have 8 different filter options all built into this one sound. So the first thing you want to do is turn on one of the filters. From there, you can select a frequency, what's going to be affected. And then depending on the type, a different thing's going to happen. So first we're going to learn about this bell, because the bell can be turned up in volume or turned down in volume. So you'll notice the frequency of the sound will either be turned up, 411 Hertz being turned up from the original source sound, or you can turn it down. Now the Q is similar to the resonance in the other one, except we're choosing how wide or how fine we want this to be. So in this case, we're really just turning up just a few tiny little frequencies, or if we make it wide, we're getting a lot of the frequencies around this 261 Hertz being turned up in a linear curve. This tight Q might be harder to notice. So this really makes EQs powerful because you can really accurately remove specific frequencies in a sound. Or you could do big, broader changes to kind of change the sound into something completely different. Now that sounds a lot different than our original sound. We're also equipped with different filter types beyond just the regular bell. You have a similar high pass as well. And you have two different levels of steepness. You have the ×4 and the shallower and lighter curved one like this. You also have the low pass version. So you have both the high pass and the low pass. You have a notch, which is where you don't get to select how much gain is being taken away or added. It's just taking away as many as it possibly can. And the last we haven't talked about are shelves. And how shelves work is based off the cutoff. It will turn everything up or down after that shelf based on the shelf shape. So this is a low shelf turning up the lows, and this is a high shelf turning up the highs. So you could put it way back here and turn up everything except the early frequencies, or you could just bump some of the high frequencies here. So it's a good way to shelf things up. Do notice as I turn this thing up in volume, to add resonance to the front here, it's actually got to take energy away from the bottom. So it creates a little valley before it creates this mountain. And this is just how the EQ has to process things. So it has to create this little volume dip before it can create a volume bump. So notice that Qs will actually take away energy from one area to add it into a new area. So now that you understand the frequency, the gain, and the different filters down here, we can move on from here. You have this headphone button, which when selected will actually let you audition just this frequency change. So as I hit play on my sound, I'm only listening to the one band I'm affecting. This will allow you to accurately listen to what you're trying to take out when you're trying to listen to a whole thing without the audition. Trying to identify a frequency in a full frequency range might be harder, especially as a beginner. But with this audition, you might be able to actually identify that. Oh yeah, that's the frequency I didn't want. Perfect. You can turn the spectral analyzer on or off. I recommend having it on. It's just very helpful to have that visual reference. Next, you can pick the mode of the EQ. So you don't have to just EQ the full stereo sound. You could actually put it in left-right mode or mid-side mode. What left-right mode does is it actually lets you have a separate set of EQ for the right ear as the left ear. So you can actually EQ both sides a little differently if maybe you're hearing a problem in just one ear that you need to take out, or you just want to add some differences in each ear. And you'll see the other one is grayed out and behind, and you can just select if you're EQing the left or EQing the right. Now you have something similar known as mid-side mode. And what mid-side mode does is it allows you to EQ the middle frequencies and the stereo frequencies differently. Now, mid and side isn't something we've talked about yet in this beginner course, but essentially know that in electronic music, things can sound wide, and this width is caused by a myriad of different things, but you can actually affect the width of the sound differently, EQ the stereo information, the wide information, different than the very centered mono information. So do just note that. Again, it's a much more advanced concept, but you do need to know that button is there for when you eventually get there. Now here you have an adaptive cue mode, and what the adaptive cue will do is it will actually make things shallower when you are doing smaller volume changes, and it will make things narrower the higher the volume changes. Now I don't really like this because it doesn't give you as much control as just doing it yourself, so I recommend having that off at all times. Next, you have a scale function. So after you're done EQing, if everything's sounding a little too dramatic, you could scale things back so it doesn't happen quite as much. Or you can go over 100% scale and you can actually increase everything you were doing, and you can actually double those changes. So it's almost like a dry wet, but I'm not going to say it is like a dry wet, but it allows you to essentially scale back the EQ changes you were doing. And lastly, you have a gain function here. So just a final output volume to turn things up or down after you're done EQing. One cool EQ hack, you can double click the spectrum here to pop it up into a window up here, so you can actually see things a lot more accurately, which is really, really helpful. Perfect. Let's move on to compression. Continuing, let's take a closer look at how compressors work. Compressors are an effect that limit the dynamic range of a sound. Now the first setting you need to know about is the threshold, because this is going to determine when it's going to start affecting that range of the sound. And how it works is, depending on how much it's going over this threshold arrow, it will start compressing. So if I'm playing our sound here, it will start compressing it. Now based off this threshold, the ratio is going to engage. And how the ratio works is, depending on the ratio, for every certain amount, only 1 decibel will come out. So let's say, for example, we have a 6:1 ratio. For every 6 decibels that go over the threshold, only 1 decibel will come out. So a higher ratio and a low threshold means we're really going to start to be turning this thing down, because if it's going over by quite a bit, maybe only 1 or 2 decibels of actual volume end up coming out. Now the attack, similar to the envelope attacks we learned earlier, is how long this thing's going to take to engage. So the really tight attack, it's going to start compressing 2 milliseconds after it goes over the threshold. And with a slow attack, it's going to take a while, and you'll hear a lot of volume manage to still cut through. Lastly is the release. So how long after it drops under the threshold is it going to stop compressing? You have an auto function which will automatically change the release time for you. I don't recommend this just because I don't like functions in Ableton where you end up losing control, which ends up moving on to the next feature, which is the makeup. And what the compressor will do is it will add some makeup gain at the end just to try and compensate for the compression you were doing. And I don't really like this, to be honest. I don't like to know how much gain is being put back in. I like to do that myself by manually changing the output volume at the end. So what I like to do is compress myself and then adjust my own makeup myself. Next, you have the 3 different types of compression. The peak compression responds to the loudest peak, while the RMS compressor responds a little slowly and responds more to the average sound. And then the expander actually works the opposite of a compressor, and instead of turning everything down when it goes over the threshold, it will actually turn it up further. So you can hear it turned it up so much it was distorting. You have a dry wet function here, so once you have the compression value that you want, you could actually dial it back so you have a blend of the original dynamic sound combined with the compressed sound, giving you this really cool sound. Now here you have a function known as the knee, and how the knee works is it will actually start to compress, start to initiate the attack as the volume approaches the threshold. So it will actually be a bit softer sounding, won't immediately initiate right as it goes over the threshold. And you can actually see that represented with this window here. This is the knee, And as you change the knee, you can see it expand or be a really hard knee, which means it will only engage the second it goes over the threshold, or a soft knee where it will actually 18 decibels before as it's coming towards it will start to initiate that attack. So it's a bit softer and a bit more transparent. Next, you have the look ahead, which will give Ableton 1 millisecond, 10 milliseconds, or 0 milliseconds to read the incoming signal ahead of time, just so it can process a little quicker and it can be a little more accurate, because sometimes when it doesn't have enough time to process, it's going to mess up, it's going to miss, it might distort even because it's working so quickly. So if you give it a bit more time to think about things, it too will be a little softer and a little more transparent. And next you have a logarithmic in linear mode for the release. Typically the logarithmic mode is a little smoother than the linear mode, so make sure to decide based on that. We have one more hidden window here, and that is actually the side chain compressor window on our compressor here. And how this works is you can actually tell an external signal to compress down our sound. So instead of the sound having to go over the threshold, what will happen is an external sound will go over the threshold and pump our sound down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to grab a kick drum really quickly to demonstrate this. So on arrangement view here, we've got kick drums like this. And I'm going to put a note in our analog above. So we have our analog and our kick going at the same time, but what we want to do is we want the kick to compress the analog out of the way as the kick is happening, giving it this pumping effect, which will actually clean up our song, make the kick more obvious, and give things some breathing effect. And this is a really popular effect in all styles of electronic music, but it's really, really common in house music. And you'll notice it once I engage this effect. So first thing you want to do is you want to turn on the sidechain compressor here. Next, you want to select where that input is coming from. So I'm actually going to select from channel 3, which is the kick drum. And then you're going to select if you want it to be post effects, so after any of the effects on the kick, or post mixer, so after the volume. I'm going to do pre effects because maybe I'm going to affect the kick differently, but I still want that compression to remain unchanged. You can set a gain, so how loud the incoming signal is. I'm just going to leave it where it was. And you can set a dry wet for this whole thing as well, but I'm going to leave it at full so you can really hear it. Now let's drag down the threshold. So you can see as the kick goes over the threshold, the gain reduces on our analog track here. Making things nice and pumpy. You have one less section here, and that is the EQ. And the EQ is not EQing like we learned before. What it is it's EQing the incoming signal, so the kick signal being sent into this thing, because that's going to have a different result. Let's say, for example, we put on the high pass here, and we're only receiving the high information. It's receiving a quicker signal than when it was the whole sound, because the low frequencies drag on. So you can just change how the incoming signal is being shaped, which will affect the result of the pumping. So experiment with that, but compression and side compression is going to be a really useful tool. And lastly, I want to finish things off with one of the most important features inside of Ableton, and those are racks. Racks are Ableton's ability to simplify routing and have multiple things grouped and active in one place. I did talk about this in a past tutorial, but there are a lot of features I didn't go into and I'm going to go into in depth. So I'm going to show this off with our instrument here, and what we're going to do is we're going to right click it and we're going to group it so it's now in its own group. What we're going to do is we're going to head on over to our instruments here. We're going to grab a new instrument and we're going to slap it in. In this case, I'm actually going to grab some sort of preset here from analog. So we have that one below and the dry one above. So this function here is actually going to show and hide all the devices involved. So that closed, you may wonder where it is. This is actually going to open and close the entire rack itself, and specifically the clip window here. And now one thing we didn't go over last time were setting up your own macros. I did show you guys with a lot of these presets that some of them actually come equipped with macros, like inside here with this preset I brought into that part of the chain. But what you can do is you can actually set up your own. So at any point, if you want to map things to a macro, we can do that. So what we're going to do is I want to map the volume of this rack here and the volume of the analog chain here, and I want them both to be on one macro here. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit this map function, and this may remind you of when we in a past tutorial set up the key mapping and MIDI mapping, except what we're going to do is we're going to click our volume function here, but then we're going to head on over to our first macro and hit map, and now the volume has been set there. We're going to go over to this rack here, and we're going to click the volume and we're going to map it there. So now both of their volumes are mapped together to this one macro. And you can do this with pretty much any feature inside of here. You can map these all together, which is really useful. And similar to the MIDI mapping and key mapping, when you open this up, you actually have a minimum and maximum range. So not everything has to be the full range with that macro. You could actually make quite a small range, so you're not moving that far, even though you're moving the full course of the macro. You can see on the right here that it's only moving that specific range. This is really powerful because you can stack and stack and stack instruments, and then you can map a lot of their same features to this one rack, so they're all controlled by these macros, and you have this one cohesive instrument made up of all these complex instruments on the inside. Then you can even just tighten things up, so you're left with just the macros in this neat and tidy looking instrument, but under the hood you know you have a really complex instrument going on. Now the final part of racks that I want to show you guys, and what really makes it powerful, are the key mapping section, velocity mapping section, and chain mapping selection. And what these are selectors inside the rack where you can choose circumstances in which each chain is playing. So they don't actually have to all play at the same time. You can actually give them certain circumstances where certain parts of the chain will play. So I'm going to set up a key one first. So what you have are the selectors for the individual chains, and this colored bar is going to say under what circumstances where it's going to play. And then above you have the actual physical range. So here this one's correlated to my keyboard because this is the key mapping. And what we're going to do is we're going to put the analog one by clicking and dragging this bar into the C3 and above range. And we're going to put the other instrument in the C3 and below range. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a G3 up here on my keyboard, and you'll see only analog plays. Now if I jump down an octave and play a G2, you could see only the other instrument plays. Up an octave, down an octave. And what's cool is you could have different styles of instruments playing across the different octave ranges, or you could have different versions of the same instrument playing across different octave ranges. So maybe as you went up your keyboard, you played a more spacey version, and as you played down your keyboard, maybe you played a more distorted version. And that moves on to our next ability where you can actually blend these. So what we're going to do is we're going to map these to their full range, so now they are both playing at the same time. But now I'm going to point out a volume fade to you. So the little bar right above the master green bar, as I drag this one to the right and I drag this one to the left, there's going to be volume fade. So now when I play really low on my octave, this it happened chain is going to be higher in volume. And when I play higher up my keyboard, this analog chain up above is going to be higher in volume. So now you can actually blend different chains with this. So I just reset everything here. Now we can check out a velocity one. So if you guys remember velocity from last tutorial, you could map volume and other things to velocity to make things feel more lifelike. Well, this is just another way of doing this. You could actually map certain velocity ranges, the higher velocity ranges and the lower velocity ranges, to different instruments in different chains. So let's say for example, we jump back to our MIDI clip here, and this one's a low chain and this one's high, and we'll do that. We'll go low, high, low, high. It'll actually jump between the two patches as it plays. And you can have up to 128 of these from 0 to 127. You could have single instances of certain instruments. So now your one instrument has actually turned into a potential 128 different instruments all stacked inside of each other. And then if you wanted to, you could group this chain and actually create another one below it. So now you have 2 stacks of 128 chains, and you can theoretically do that infinitely as long as your computer can hold it. So again, racks, just thinking about it, are so powerful. They're this simplified, amazing way of stacking instruments and ideas. Now there's one more window, and this one's really cool. This one's the chain selector, similar to the velocity in the key, except instead of being based off velocity or key, this is actually based off this selector up here. So what we could do is we could pick a specific range for this one, and we could pick a specific range for this one. And then learning our macro functions, we could map this selector here. So now we can actually select different instruments based off this. And so now just imagine we could bring in a bunch of instruments here. And we could set different ranges for each of them. And then based off this selector, different ones will play. So I hope that's really opening your mind to how powerful this can be. And this isn't just limited to instruments. You can also create with racks with audio effects. So you could have this one macro sweep between a bunch of different effects in a rack, and your sound could morph and evolve and change thanks to the power of racks. So now with your understanding of some of the more important effects inside of Ableton, racks, and subtractive synthesis, you're ready to go off on your own and start to research these further in depth so you can really flesh out your understanding of these tools. Oof, so there we go, guys. That was part 4 of our Ableton beginner course. That was probably the most exciting one because now you guys can actually really make sounds and start using the tools inside of Ableton. Now make sure if you haven't already, head down to the description of this video where you can grab our free Ableton Starter Sample Pack. These are all the samples you're going to need to start writing professional sounding music. In part 5, we're no longer going to be going over any of the things inside of Ableton. You have everything you need to know now to start writing music. What we're actually going to be going through is step-by-step how to write a song. I'm going to be taking you guys step-by-step through the process of writing this song here. So make sure to stick around for video number 5. Anyways, thanks again, guys. My name's Cymatics, we're Cymatics, and I'll be back soon with another tutorial. Peace.